What would you do if someone told you that a bench in a public park was theirs, and that you had no right to sit there? Sounds ridiculous, right? But that's exactly what happened to me on a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I haven't been able to forget it since. I had just finished a long week of work, feeling the weight of stress tugging at my shoulders. So, I decided to escape it all for a while, taking a peaceful walk to the park. It was the perfect day for it. The sun was shining just the right way, casting a warm glow over everything, while a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of the tall oak trees. A deep breath of fresh air, the quiet murmur of distant conversations, the sound of children laughing, it was exactly what I needed. I spotted the perfect bench nestled in the shade, tucked away under the oak tree. Not too far from the playground, so I could still hear the hum of the park, but far enough to avoid the noise of the busy trail where joggers seemed to race by every few minutes. It was a quiet, almost serene spot, just what I needed to unwind. I sat down, stretched my legs out in front of me, and took my first sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. The book in my hands was just beginning to pull me into its world when I heard the unmistakable click of high heels on the pavement. It wasn't the usual sound of someone walking, it was fast, determined, and getting closer by the second. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just someone passing by. But then the footsteps stopped, and I felt an icy presence looming over me. I looked up slowly, and there she was. A woman, probably in her late 50s, wearing an expensive beige suit, arms crossed, and a look on her face that could freeze anyone in their tracks. I was about to politely offer a smile when she spoke, her voice sharp and cold, as if I had already broken some unspoken rule. "You're sitting in my spot," she declared. And just like that, my quiet afternoon turned into a confrontation I couldn't have predicted in a million years. I blinked, still processing her words, unsure whether she was joking or serious. "Your spot?" I repeated, trying to make sense of the situation. She didn't crack a smile, didn't show any hint of humor in her gaze. This wasn't a casual comment, this was an accusation, as though I had committed some unforgivable crime. I shifted uncomfortably on the bench, my mind racing. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Maybe she was just lost in thought, or perhaps there was some kind of rule I wasn't aware of. "No," she said, her voice clipped, almost authoritative. "I've been sitting here every afternoon for years. This is my spot, and you have no business taking it." She looked at me, arms still crossed, her expression growing more intense by the second. Her gaze swept over me, as if she were appraising me, making sure I understood the weight of her words. Her oversized sunglasses perched on her head only added to the air of superiority she exuded. I couldn't believe it. I glanced around, half expecting to see a plaque or some sign designating this bench as reserved for, insert entitled person's name here. But there was nothing. It was just a bench in a public park, one of many scattered around, free for anyone to sit on. My patience, already starting to thin, flickered as I raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this is a public park. There's no sign here saying this bench is reserved for anyone," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't like that one bit. "You don't understand," she snapped, taking a step closer, her heels clicking even louder on the pavement. "People around here know this bench is mine. It's an unspoken agreement. I come here every day, and I expect people to respect that." She shook her head, as if she were dealing with some lost soul who just couldn't grasp the simple rules of society. I shook my head in disbelief. "With all due respect, I don't think I'm breaking any rules by sitting here. I'm just trying to enjoy my afternoon like everyone else," I said, still trying to reason with her. "I'm not planning to stay long. You can sit here when I'm done, if you'd like." But instead of accepting that, she huffed loudly, letting out a disgusted laugh. "Respect?" she repeated, as if the word itself disgusted her. "You need to show some respect, for the park, for the people who've been coming here for years, and especially for me. Her voice dripped with condescension, and I could feel the anger rising in my chest. What was it about this woman that made her think she could treat others like this? Respect for what? I asked, my patience starting to wear thin. This is just a bench. You don't own it. No one owns it. It's a public space. I stood up slowly, my body tense, but trying not to escalate the situation. If you'd like to sit, there are plenty of other benches around here. Her eyes widened as if I had just insulted her. You have no idea how long I've been coming to this park. Longer than you've probably lived here, she snapped. And for years, people around here have known to stay out of my spot. And now you think you can just come in here and take it? Her voice was rising now, louder and more forceful. She was drawing attention, and I could see people glancing over, unsure of what was going on. I took a step back, realizing this wasn't just about a bench, it was about power. Karen wasn't asking for something reasonable. She was demanding compliance, assuming that just because she had been sitting there for years, she could control who else did. I wasn't about to give in, not now. Listen, I said, trying one last time to be reasonable, this isn't your bench. I'm not trying to disrespect you. I'm just sitting here for a few minutes to clear my head. If you want to sit, I'll move, but I don't see why you're making this such a big deal. She took a deep breath, eyes narrowing as she assessed me, and for a moment, I thought she might relent. But then she straightened up, her posture rigid with self-importance. You don't get it, she said, her tone icy. People like you, people who think they can just take whatever they want, don't understand how things work around here. She paused, letting her words sink in. I've been coming here for years, and no one ever dared to sit on my bench. You'll regret this. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she turned on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking loudly as she made her way down the path. I stood there, still processing everything that had just happened. I hadn't expected such a bizarre confrontation over something so trivial. As the sounds of the park slowly resumed, I sat back down, trying to calm my thoughts. But the anger in my chest didn't dissipate easily. This wasn't just about a bench. Karen had crossed a line, her sense of entitlement, her belief that she could control public space just because she had been using it for years, was infuriating. I wasn't going to let her push me around. As I sat back down, I realized this wasn't over. It couldn't be. If Karen thought she could just waltz into a public space and claim ownership over it, what else was she doing in this neighborhood? What else had she convinced people to accept as her personal territory? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The real battle had just begun. After the confrontation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's behavior was more than just an isolated incident. Something about her attitude, how she believed she could control an entire public space, struck me as an abuse of power, one that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't just upset about a bench, she was trying to impose her will on a shared space, manipulating situations to suit her desires. This wasn't about public seating, it was about control. And that was something I wasn't going to let slide. I spent the next few days thinking about my options. I could brush this off and let it go, but something told me that wouldn't be the end of it. I'd seen her reaction. Her entitlement was toxic, and if I didn't stand up now, she would keep pushing. It wasn't just about protecting my right to sit on a park bench anymore. It was about standing up to an unjust system where people like Karen thought they could dictate how everyone else lived. I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. I started by doing my homework. I spent hours researching the laws governing public spaces in the park and learning what rights I had as a citizen in my own community. I knew that the bench wasn't reserved for anyone, it was a public park, open to all. But I also knew that Karen wouldn't back down just because she was wrong. She had a sense of entitlement, and that kind of mindset often led to manipulation of rules to get her way. The more I read, the more I realized that this was bigger than a petty dispute over a bench. Karen's behavior wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. She had been using her position on the HOA board to push her own agenda, and I had no doubt that this wasn't the first time she had tried to bully someone into giving up their rights. I called up a lawyer, one who specialized in property rights and public space regulations. I wanted to know exactly where I stood. The lawyer was reassuring. "You have every right to sit wherever you want in a public park," he told me. "There's no law preventing you from using a bench." It was clear, I wasn't doing anything wrong. But Karen's threats weren't going to stop at a simple dispute over seating. She had already shown how far she was willing to go to control the situation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to be ready for her next move. She'd already made one attempt to intimidate me. Who's to say she wouldn't escalate things further? So, I began documenting everything. I made sure to take pictures of the park, focusing on the benches and how they were all clearly meant for public use. I made a note of the exact spot where the confrontation had taken place, and I kept a record of my interactions with Karen. If this went any further, I needed to be prepared to defend myself, both legally and publicly. The idea that someone could claim ownership over a public bench just because they frequented the park more often was absurd. It was a power grab, plain and simple, and I wasn't going to let Karen win. I started talking to some of my neighbors, casually bringing up the issue of park benches and whether anyone had ever had problems with Karen. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Several of my neighbors had similar stories about Karen's overreach, whether it was claiming spots in public places or trying to push her personal agenda through the HOA. They had learned to tolerate her, avoid confrontation, and let her think she was in control. But now, it seemed like the community had finally had enough. Some of them expressed frustration with Karen's behavior, and a few even offered to back me up if things got ugly. That's when I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. This wasn't just about a single bench in a single park anymore. It was about fighting back against the entitlement that had seeped into the very structure of our community. Karen's sense of ownership over public spaces wasn't something that should be tolerated. It was time for her to understand that no one, not her, not the HOA, not anyone, had the right to dictate how the rest of us lived. I prepared for a meeting with the HOA. I wanted to lay out the facts, make it clear that what Karen was doing wasn't just unfair, it was a violation of public space rights. I printed out all the research I had done, gathered support from my neighbors, and took notes on everything Karen had said and done in our confrontation. I knew she wouldn't back down easily, but I was ready. This fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was for everyone who had been silenced or pushed around by Karen's manipulative behavior. The next time I saw her, I knew it would be different. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me again. I was prepared for whatever came next. The battle had just begun, but now I felt ready. It was time to take a stand, no more letting Karen and her sense of entitlement run the show. She'd pushed too far, and it was time for me to push back. The day I had been preparing for finally came. I had anticipated that Karen's actions would escalate, but nothing could have prepared me for the intensity of what followed. It started with a letter. A formal one. It came in a thick envelope, the kind you get when someone is taking things seriously, and I could already tell by the weight of it that this wasn't just a neighborly complaint. The letter, signed by the HOA, demanded that I remove myself from the bench I had wrongfully occupied and apologized for the disruption I had caused. The language in the letter was calm, polite even, but the intent was unmistakable. I had violated some kind of community standard. It didn't take much to figure out who had orchestrated this. Karen had used her position on the HOA board to push her personal vendetta forward, making it clear that she was using her power to try to enforce a rule that didn't exist. She was trying to bend the rules, making them fit her narrative. And I was being dragged into her warped version of reality. I didn't waste time with the letter. Instead, I called my lawyer right away. He reassured me that the HOA couldn't force me to vacate a public bench in a public park. It was absurd. There were no laws or agreements backing Karen's claim. But I knew that Karen wouldn't just give up. No, this was bigger than one public bench. She was trying to push a community-wide issue, one where she had the power to control spaces that didn't belong to her. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and more letters from the HOA. Karen's influence within the board had clearly paid off, and now, she was using it to escalate the situation. She was relentless, pushing the issue with the city, filing complaints about my supposed disrespect of the park. I was being threatened with fines and further legal action, but no one could explain exactly what I had done wrong. The park didn't belong to Karen, and neither did the benches. Still, the more I fought back, the more Karen doubled down on her attempts to make me feel like the villain in this bizarre drama. It wasn't long before I found out Karen wasn't just targeting me. She had been talking to other community members, making sure they signed petitions and sending out vague threats that anyone who didn't comply would face consequences. She had even tried to rally support by making it seem like I was the one disrupting the community, not her. She played the victim, positioning herself as a defender of the park's integrity, but everyone could see through it. At least, I hoped they could. I began hearing from my neighbors who had seen her tactics firsthand. One by one, they told me stories about how Karen had used the HOA to push her personal agenda in the past. She'd done it to others, making unreasonable demands, taking things too far, and treating people like they were inferior to her sense of order. But what struck me most was when they told me they had finally had enough of her. They were tired of her trying to make decisions for everyone, and they didn't want her to succeed in making a petty issue into a community-wide problem. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had the support of the people around me, and the more I learned about Karen's manipulative ways, the more determined I became to stop her. This wasn't just about one bench. It was about standing up to someone who thought their entitled behavior gave them the right to control everyone else's lives. The moment of reckoning came when Karen showed up in person. I had just returned to the park for another attempt at normalcy, hoping this would all blow over, but there she was, her figure sharp against the bright sky. She was standing near the bench, glaring at me like I was the one who had committed some great injustice. This time, though, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a park ranger, an official figure with the badge that made him appear as though he were there to enforce some law. He was standing with his arms crossed, unsure of what to make of the situation, but clearly, Karen had convinced him to step in. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice dripping with smugness. "This has gone far enough. You've disrupted the peace here, and it's time for you to move." She gestured to the park ranger, who was now looking at me with a slight air of confusion, as if he was caught between doing his job and knowing that this wasn't really a serious issue. He looked at Karen, then back at me, waiting for me to respond. I kept my composure. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me this time. "Karen," I said slowly, making sure my voice was steady, "this is a public park, and these benches are for everyone. There is no rule that says you own this one or that I can't sit here." I glanced at the park ranger. "I'm not breaking any laws, and I don't know why I'm being treated like a criminal for sitting on a bench in a public space." Karen didn't like that. She started her tirade again, yelling about respect and how she had been coming here for years. The park ranger shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't eager to be involved in what was clearly a personal issue, but he still had to listen. At that moment, I realized just how far Karen was willing to take this. It wasn't just about winning. It was about her sense of control, her belief that people should bow to her will. She was determined to make me feel guilty for standing up for myself. But I wasn't backing down. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, keeping my voice firm but calm. "And neither is the bench. You can't control where people sit just because you've made it your routine." The park ranger, finally realizing the situation was far more ridiculous than he had been led to believe, sighed. "There's nothing I can do here," he said, glancing at Karen before turning to me. "You're free to sit where you like." Karen stood there, seething. The look in her eyes told me this wasn't over. She hadn't won, and she wasn't about to admit defeat, but for now, the bench was mine. I had no idea where this battle would go next, but one thing was certain: I was ready for whatever Karen had planned. She had escalated things to this point, and now I was determined to stand my ground. I wasn't going to let her take over something so simple, so public, and so essential. This was about far more than a bench. It was about a community standing up to one person's toxic sense of entitlement. And I wasn't backing down. The day of the public hearing arrived, and with it came the realization that this battle was about far more than a single bench in a public park. It had become a symbol of something larger, a struggle against Karen's unchecked entitlement and her attempt to control what wasn't hers to dictate. As I walked into the community meeting room, I felt a sense of determination settle over me. I wasn't just fighting for my right to sit on a park bench, I was standing up against the unfairness of one person trying to impose their will on everyone else. The room was filled with local officials and residents, and at the front sat Karen, looking as smug and self-assured as ever. She had made it clear that she believed this meeting was her chance to finally put an end to my defiance. Karen began her speech with a tone of self-righteousness, framing herself as the defender of the community's standards. She talked about the importance of respecting the park's traditions, about how longtime residents like her deserved special consideration, and how my actions had disrupted the peace. But the more she spoke, the more absurd her claims seemed. One by one, people began to speak up. My neighbors, who had been quiet during her earlier reign of influence, now stepped forward with stories of how Karen had pushed her personal agenda on others, how she had tried to claim ownership of spaces that didn't belong to her. They weren't afraid to call her out, to expose the true nature of her behavior. As the room shifted, it was clear that the tide had turned. Even some members of the HOA board, who had previously seemed to entertain Karen's ideas, started to question the validity of her demands. And then came the final blow. One of the city officials, a calm and level-headed voice, stated that there was no legal precedent for what Karen was trying to do. Public spaces like the park and its benches were open to everyone, regardless of who had been coming there for years. The complaint was dismissed. The look on Karen's face as the decision was announced was priceless. Her face flushed with anger, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, she didn't have a comeback. She stood there, silent, as the laughter in the room grew louder. With nothing left to say, Karen stormed out of the room, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. I could see the moment she realized her power had been stripped away. The community had seen through her manipulation, and they weren't willing to let her dictate their lives any longer. The relief that followed was almost palpable. As the room began to disperse, I could feel the weight of the past weeks lift off my shoulders. I had stood my ground, and in doing so, had not only defended my right to enjoy a public park, but had also helped show others in the community that they didn't have to bow to Karen's will. The fight was over. The community had stood together, and together, we had defeated her. As I walked back into the park later that afternoon, I found myself sitting on that same bench once again. This time, I felt a sense of peace. The park was exactly what it had always been, a public space for everyone to enjoy. No one owned it, and no one had the right to control it. And as I took another sip of my coffee, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to back down. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who thought they could control you or your space? How did you handle it? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.